I've been sitting on this bench for a long time, and I've learned something important. The loud cases get attention, but the quiet ones stay with you. The ones where a person doesn't argue, doesn't complain, doesn't try to impress anyone. They just stand there and tell the truth the best way they know how. This story began on one of those days, a day when a simple sentence stopped my courtroom cold and reminded me why I still do this job. That morning started like most others. I woke up early before the house stirred. I made my coffee the same way I always do, strong and black. I've had it that way for decades. My wife says consistency is my greatest strength and my greatest flaw. She's probably right. As I sat at the kitchen table, I thought about my father. I do that a lot in the mornings. He was a hard-working man, a proud man, but never loud about it. He believed in responsibility, but he also believed in kindness. He used to say, "Frank, people don't wake up trying to disappoint the world." That sentence has followed me into every courtroom I've ever stepped into. I put on my robe and headed to the courthouse. Same route, same parking spot, same walk through the doors. I've been doing it so long that my body knows the routine before my mind does. Christina was already there when I arrived. She smiled, handed me my coffee, and said good morning. She knows how I like it. She always does. I sat down and reviewed the day's docket. Traffic violations, minor infractions, the usual mix. To most people, it looks ordinary. To me, it never is. Because I know behind every piece of paper is a person with a life I can't see. One file caught my attention right away. The name was unfamiliar, but the note written in the margin made me pause. It said elderly defendant and veteran. I leaned back slightly in my chair and took a breath. Those notes don't decide cases, but they tell me to listen carefully. Before court began, I looked out at the empty courtroom, the benches, the flags, the quiet. I've spent so much of my life in that room that I can feel when a day is going to matter. I had that feeling again. When the session started, people filtered in slowly. I heard the usual sounds, papers rustling, shoes scuffing the floor, nervous whispers. Court has a way of making everyone feel small, even when they haven't done anything serious. I called the first few cases, routine explanations, routine rulings. I listened, I spoke, and we moved along. That rhythm is important. It keeps things fair. Then Christina called the next name. I looked up and saw him stand. He moved slowly, not dramatically, just carefully. I watched him take a few steps forward, steadying himself as he walked. He was an older man, thin, with shoulders that had clearly carried a lot over the years. He wore a worn jacket that looked like it had been with him longer than some people in the room had been alive. I noticed his hands right away. They trembled slightly as he held his papers, not from fear, but from age, from time, from life. I asked him to come forward, and he did. He stood at the podium and looked up at me. His eyes were clear, tired but clear. I've seen those eyes before, the eyes of someone who's lived through things without talking much about them. I asked him his name. He said it softly but clearly. I asked him what brought him into court that day. He told me it was a traffic violation, nothing serious on paper, but I've learned not to underestimate paper. I asked him to tell me what happened. I always do. I want to hear it in their words. He took a breath before speaking, a long one. He said he was trying his best. That's how he started. He didn't say he was right. He didn't say the officer was wrong. He just said, "Your Honor, I'm trying my best." Those words landed heavy. I asked him to continue. He explained that he had trouble reading the signs sometimes. He said his eyesight wasn't what it used to be. He said he drove slowly and carefully, but sometimes he made mistakes. He said he never meant to break the law. As he spoke, I listened closely. I could hear something else in his voice. Pride, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't want pity. I asked him how old he was. He told me he was well into his 80s. I asked him if he lived alone. He nodded. He said he still tried to do everything himself. I asked him if he had served in the military. He straightened just a little when he answered that question. He said yes. He said it without boasting, just fact. He told me where he served and when. I won't forget the way he said it. Calm, steady, like it was just another part of his life. I felt something tighten in my chest. I thought about what that generation gave. I thought about how many of them came home and never asked for recognition. They just went back to work. I asked him about the ticket itself. He explained it as best he could. He admitted he made a mistake. He didn't argue the law. He didn't argue the officer. He just explained the situation. As he spoke, the courtroom grew quiet. Not because I demanded it, because everyone was listening. I could see people leaning forward slightly, even the ones waiting for their own cases. They felt it too. There was no performance here, no strategy, just honesty. I asked him how he was managing day to day. He hesitated, then said he did what he could. He said he didn't like asking for help. He said he'd always taken care of himself. Then he looked at me again and said the words that changed the room. He said, "I'm trying my best, Your Honor." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look away. He just said it. And in that moment, my courtroom went completely silent. I felt it. The weight of those words. I've heard every excuse imaginable over the years. But that wasn't an excuse. That was a statement of effort, of dignity. I took a breath and leaned forward slightly. I wanted him to know I was listening. I wanted him to know those words mattered. I didn't speak right away. Silence can be powerful when it's earned. I looked at him, then at the file, then back at him again. Inside, I was thinking about my father, about the men of his generation, about how they measured themselves by effort, not outcome. I knew this case was going to be about more than a ticket, and I knew whatever I said next needed to be said carefully, because sometimes a courtroom isn't just a place where the law is applied. Sometimes it's a place where a person needs to be seen. And that moment was only the beginning. I looked at him for a long moment before I said anything. I've learned that when someone speaks from a place that honest, you don't rush past it. You let it sit. You let the room feel it. And that's exactly what happened. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Even the air felt still. I asked him to tell me a little more about his day. I kept my voice gentle. He nodded and said he woke up early, like he always does. He said old habits don't go away easily. He made himself breakfast, took his medication, and checked the weather before deciding to run a few errands. Nothing unusual, just a man trying to live his life. He told me driving wasn't as easy as it used to be. He said his hands didn't move as fast, and his eyes didn't catch everything right away. But he said he didn't want to give it up yet. He said driving was his independence. I understood that immediately. Independence means everything when you've spent your life standing on your own feet. I asked him what the ticket was for. He told me it was for failing to come to a complete stop. He said he thought he had. He said he slowed down, looked both ways, and went through carefully. He didn't argue the officer's judgment. He just said he didn't mean to be careless. I watched his face as he spoke. There was no anger there, no frustration directed at the officer or the system, just concern. Concern that he had done something wrong. Concern that maybe he wasn't as capable as he used to be. I asked him how long he had been driving. He smiled faintly and told me longer than I'd been alive. That got a quiet reaction from the room. Not laughter, respect. You could feel it. I asked him about his service. I always do when it comes up, not out of obligation, but out of appreciation. He told me where he was stationed. He told me what years he served. He didn't go into detail. Men like him rarely do. They carry those memories quietly. As he spoke, I thought about how many times he must have stood at attention, how many times he followed orders without question, how many sacrifices he made without expecting thanks. And here he was now, standing in my courtroom, apologizing for a mistake. I asked him if he had family nearby. He shook his head. He said most of them had passed on. He said he had a niece who called him once a week. He smiled when he mentioned her. That smile said more than words. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest again. Not sadness exactly, more like awareness of time, of aging, of how quickly roles reverse. The strong become careful, the independent become cautious. I asked him how the ticket made him feel. He hesitated before answering. He said it made him wonder if he was becoming a danger to others. That answer hit hard. That wasn't about money. That was about identity. I leaned forward slightly. I wanted him to hear me clearly. I told him that trying your best matters. I told him effort matters. I told him that acknowledging limitations takes courage, not weakness. I could see his eyes glisten. He blinked a few times and nodded. He said he just didn't want to be a burden. That word hung in the air. Burden. I've heard it too many times from people who have given more than they ever took. I told him something I believe deeply. I told him that people who try their best are never a burden. People who care are never a burden. The room stayed silent as I said it. Sometimes words find the people who need them. I asked him if this was his first ticket. He nodded. He said he'd been driving all his life without trouble. I believed him, not because of his age, but because of his honesty. I glanced at Christina again. She had her hands folded, listening closely. She felt it too. Everyone did. I looked down at the file one more time. The violation was there, clear. The law was clear too, but so was the context, and context is where justice lives. I thought about my own future, about what it would feel like to stand where he was standing one day, about hoping someone would listen, about hoping effort would be seen. I asked him one final question before ruling. I asked him what trying his best meant to him. He thought about it for a moment, then said it meant getting up every day and doing right by others, even when it was harder than it used to be. That answer silenced the room all over again. I sat back in my chair and took a slow breath. I felt the weight of the decision settle in. I knew this wasn't just about dismissing or enforcing a ticket. It was about dignity, about acknowledging a lifetime of effort. I looked at him and prepared to speak. I knew whatever I said next would matter, not just to him, but to everyone listening, because sometimes the law teaches best when it speaks softly, and in that moment my courtroom was ready to listen. I let the silence breathe for a moment before I spoke again. I've learned not to rush moments like that. When a room goes quiet on its own, it's because something important has been said. I wanted to honor that. I told him I appreciated his honesty. I told him that not everyone who comes into my courtroom is willing to admit fear or uncertainty. I said that takes strength, real strength, the kind you don't see in loud voices or excuses. I asked him if the officer had explained the violation clearly at the scene. He nodded and said yes. He said the officer was respectful. He said he didn't argue because he didn't want to make things harder for anyone. That answer told me everything about the kind of man he was. I asked him if he still felt comfortable driving. He paused before answering. He said most days he did, but some days were harder than others. He said he avoided driving at night now. He said he planned his routes carefully so he wouldn't rush. He said he tried to be extra careful because he didn't want to hurt anyone. As he spoke, I felt a deep respect for him grow. This wasn't denial. This was responsibility. This was someone actively adjusting to change instead of ignoring it. I told him something I've learned over many years. I told him that growing older isn't about losing ability. It's about gaining awareness. And awareness, I said, makes people safer, not weaker. I could see his shoulders relax slightly when I said that. Sometimes people don't need forgiveness. They need reassurance that they still matter. I asked him if anyone had ever talked to him about alternative options. things like driving courses for seniors or vision rechecks. I wasn't asking to lecture him. I was asking because I cared. He said no. He said he didn't even know those options existed. I told him there was no shame in seeking support. I told him the goal wasn't to take independence away. The goal was to protect it. I said the safest drivers are the ones who know their limits and plan around them. The courtroom stayed silent as I spoke. I wasn't just talking to him anymore. I was talking to everyone who feared becoming invisible one day. I thought about my father again, about how proud he was of being useful, about how hard it was for him to slow down, about the quiet dignity with which he aged. Those memories were close in that moment. I looked back at the veteran and told him his service mattered. I said it mattered then, and it mattered now. I said the values he carried into the military didn't disappear with age. They showed up in moments like this. His eyes filled, but he didn't cry. He just nodded slowly. Men of his generation often don't let tears fall easily, but you could feel them there. I glanced at the gallery. I saw people sitting straighter. I saw a young man lower his phone. I saw a woman wipe her eyes quickly. This was one of those moments where the lesson reached beyond the case. I looked back down at the ticket. The fine wasn't large, but the meaning behind it was. I knew I had a choice to make: enforce the letter of the law or recognize the spirit behind the man standing before me. I told him that the law exists to keep people safe. I said it's not meant to punish those who are genuinely trying to do right. I said when someone comes into my courtroom with humility and responsibility, that matters. I paused again. I could feel my heart beating a little slower, clearer. I knew what I needed to do. I told him I was going to dismiss the ticket. I said it plainly, case dismissed. For a moment he didn't react. Then his shoulders dropped. Not dramatically, just enough to show relief. He looked at me and said, "Thank you." Just 2 words, but they carried a lifetime of meaning. I told him to keep doing what he was doing, to stay careful, to stay aware, and to never stop trying his best. I said those words slowly because I wanted him to hear them. He nodded again, and as he turned to leave, I watched him walk a little taller than when he came in. The room stayed quiet even after he stepped away. No applause, no noise, just respect. I took a breath and prepared to call the next case, but before I could, something happened that surprised me. I noticed movement in the back of the courtroom. Someone stood up, and I had a feeling this story wasn't finished yet. I looked toward the back of the courtroom and saw a younger man standing slowly. He hesitated for a moment, like he wasn't sure if he should speak. I could tell he was nervous. That matters to me. When someone is nervous about speaking up, it usually means what they're about to say is sincere. I asked him to identify himself. He cleared his throat and told me he was the officer who had issued the ticket. His voice was respectful. There was no edge in it. He wasn't defensive. That told me a lot right away. He said he wanted to say something, not to challenge my decision, but to add context. I nodded and told him to go ahead. I believe in letting people speak when it comes from the right place. He explained that when he pulled the veteran over, he didn't sense disrespect or recklessness. He said the man was calm, cooperative, and polite. He said he had no doubt the veteran was trying his best. He said the ticket was issued because the violation was clear, but he wanted the court to know there was no malice involved. As I listened, I felt something settle inside me. This wasn't conflict, this was alignment. The officer wasn't there to protect his pride. He was there to protect the truth. I thanked him for speaking up. I told him that professionalism isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about recognizing humanity while doing it. He nodded and returned to his seat. The courtroom remained quiet, not tense, thoughtful. I looked back at the veteran who was still standing near the aisle. I asked him to wait just a moment longer. He turned back toward me, his posture respectful, his hands folded neatly in front of him. I told him that hearing from the officer confirmed something important. I told him it confirmed that his effort showed even in moments of mistake. I said that matters more than perfection. I could see his eyes soften again. He nodded slowly, deliberately. I then addressed the courtroom as a whole. I do that sometimes when a case carries a lesson that extends beyond one person. I told everyone listening that trying your best doesn't mean you won't make mistakes. It means you take responsibility when you do. I said that this man didn't come into my courtroom asking for sympathy. He came asking for fairness. And fairness, I said, includes listening. I paused again. Silence returned, but this time it felt different. It felt settled, like everyone understood what had just happened. I told the veteran one more thing before letting him go. I told him that if the day ever came when driving felt like too much, asking for help wouldn't erase his independence. It would protect it. I told him strength isn't stubbornness. Strength is wisdom. He looked at me and smiled. A small smile, but real. He thanked me again and slowly made his way out of the courtroom. I watched him until he disappeared through the doors. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Even after he was gone, the room stayed still. No one reached for their phone. No one whispered. That silence said more than any reaction ever could. I finally called the next case, but the energy had changed. People were different now, more attentive, more patient. It's amazing how one moment of humanity can reset an entire room. As the session continued, I kept thinking about something the veteran said. I'm trying my best. Those words echoed in my mind, not as an excuse, but as a standard we could all hold ourselves to. Later that afternoon, after court had adjourned, Christina came into my chambers. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat down. That's how I knew it had affected her, too. She told me she hoped someone would treat her father the same way one day. I nodded. I hoped the same thing. That evening when I went home, I told my wife about the case. I told her about the silence in the courtroom, about the officer speaking up, about a man who had given so much and still felt the need to apologize for a mistake. She listened carefully, then said something that stayed with me. She said, "People like that remind us what grace looks like." She was right. I thought about how easy it is to forget that effort doesn't always look polished. Sometimes it looks slow. Sometimes it looks uncertain. Sometimes it looks like an elderly man standing alone at a podium doing his best. I realized then that the reason my response left the courtroom silent wasn't because of authority. It wasn't because of power. It was because everyone recognized the truth. Trying your best still matters. And in that moment, my courtroom understood it together. When you're ready, just say, "Continue part 5, and I'll finish the story through parts 5, 6, and the final reflection. As the afternoon went on, I kept thinking about how rarely we stop to acknowledge effort, not success, not results, just effort. Courtrooms usually measure outcomes, guilty or not, fine or no fine, but that day reminded me that effort deserves recognition too. When court finally adjourned, I stayed back in my chambers longer than usual. I didn't rush to pack up. I sat there quietly, replaying the day in my mind. The veteran's voice, the way he said those words without asking for anything in return. I'm trying my best. That sentence stayed with me. A little later, Christina knocked on my door. She stepped in and told me someone had left something at the front desk. It was a small envelope, no return address, just my name written carefully on the front. I opened it slowly. Inside was a short handwritten note. The handwriting was neat but shaky. I recognized it immediately. It was from the veteran. He wrote that he wanted to thank me again, not for dismissing the ticket, but for listening. He said he hadn't felt seen in a long time. He said most days he felt invisible, like the world was moving faster than he could keep up with. But that day, for a few minutes, he felt like he still mattered. I sat back in my chair and held that note for a long time. I've received many letters over the years, some angry, some grateful, but the quiet ones like that are the ones that stay with you. He ended the note by saying he would look into getting his eyes checked again and maybe take one of the driving courses I mentioned. He said he wanted to keep doing things the right way for as long as he could. That told me everything. I thought about how much courage it takes to admit change, especially for someone who grew up believing strength meant never slowing down. That generation carried the weight of the world without complaint, and now many of them carry it alone. That evening I went home and sat at the dinner table with my wife. I told her about the note. I read it to her out loud. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said moments like that were why I stayed on the bench so long. She was right. They remind me that justice isn't just about enforcing rules. It's about dignity. Over the next few days, I noticed something interesting. People came into my courtroom differently. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe word had spread, but I saw more honesty, more people saying they made a mistake without trying to dress it up. I heard it again, that phrase, "I'm trying my best." Different voices, different situations, but the same meaning. It made me wonder how often people are doing exactly that, and how rarely we stop to notice. A week later, I saw the veteran again, not in court, outside the courthouse. He was walking slowly toward the entrance with a younger man beside him. His nephew, I assumed. He saw me and smiled. He gave me a small wave. I nodded back. That moment stayed with me, too. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. And quiet moments often say the most. I've learned something important over the years. Silence doesn't always mean discomfort. Sometimes it means respect. That silence in my courtroom that day wasn't awkward. It was shared understanding. People talk about powerful responses. They imagine raised voices or strong words. But the response that left my courtroom silent wasn't loud at all. It was simple. It was listening. It was recognizing effort. I still think about that case, especially when I feel tired, especially when the routine feels heavy. It reminds me why I walk into that courtroom every morning, because sometimes all someone needs is to hear that their best is enough. And when a courtroom understands that together, even for a moment, it becomes something more than a room with rules. It becomes a place where humanity still matters. In the weeks that followed, that case stayed with me more than most. I would be driving to the courthouse, stopping at red lights, watching people rush past me, and I'd think about how many of them were trying their best in ways no one could see. That thought has a way of slowing you down. One morning not long after, Christina brought me my coffee and said something quietly before court started. She said the veteran had called the clerk's office, not to ask for anything, not to complain, just to say thank you again. He wanted us to know he had scheduled an eye exam and signed up for a senior driving course. He said it felt good to take responsibility instead of feeling ashamed. I smiled when I heard that. Not because I expected it, but because it showed me the ruling had done what it was supposed to do. It hadn't just resolved a case. It had encouraged growth. That's what people don't always understand about justice. When it's done right, it doesn't end at the courthouse doors. It follows people home. It changes how they move through the world. That same week, I had another elderly defendant appear in front of me. Different case, different circumstances. But when he finished explaining himself, he looked at me and said, almost apologetically, that he was trying his best. The room went quiet again, not because I demanded it, because everyone understood. I realized then that the silence wasn't about me at all. It wasn't about my response or my authority. It was about recognition. People recognize sincerity when they hear it, and when they do, it commands respect. I thought again about my father, about how hard he worked without ever asking for praise, about how he measured himself by effort, not applause. He would have understood that veteran perfectly, and I think he would have been proud of how that moment unfolded. That afternoon, after court, I sat alone in my chambers and reflected on something simple. The law is firm. It has to be. But it doesn't have to be cold. There's room for understanding without sacrificing responsibility. I've seen people come into my courtroom defensive, loud, demanding, and I've seen people come in quiet, nervous, apologetic. The ones who say they're trying their best usually aren't asking to be excused. They're asking to be understood. That day reminded me that listening is sometimes the most powerful thing a judge can do. Not interrupting, not rushing, just listening. I've also learned that dignity matters more as people age, not less. When strength fades, pride often becomes the last thing people hold on to. Treating that pride gently can make all the difference. The response that left my courtroom silent wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed. It came from experience, from memory, from respect. It came from recognizing a man who had already given more than most ever will. And that silence wasn't empty. It was full of respect, full of understanding, full of something we don't see enough of anymore. Grace. I still hear his voice sometimes when I'm deciding a case. I'm trying my best. It reminds me to look beyond the violation and see the person standing in front of me. Because at the end of the day, that's what justice is supposed to do. After all these years on the bench, I've come to understand something very clearly. The cases that truly stay with me aren't the ones where voices are raised or tempers flare. They're the quiet ones, the ones where a person stands in front of me without armor, without excuses, just honesty. That elderly veteran was one of those cases. Long after that day ended, long after I took off my robe and left the courthouse, his words followed me home. I'm trying my best. I kept hearing them in my mind, not as a plea, not as a defense, but as a statement of character. Those words carried a lifetime of discipline, sacrifice, and quiet perseverance. I thought about how many years that man had lived by rules, military rules, moral rules, rules that asked for duty before comfort. And now, in his later years, he stood in my courtroom worried that he was falling short, not because he didn't care anymore, but because he cared so deeply. A few weeks after that hearing, Christina told me the veteran had sent another letter, not typed, handwritten again, careful, deliberate, the kind of writing that takes time. I opened it slowly, already knowing it would matter. He wrote that he had completed the driving course. He said it was humbling to sit in a classroom again at his age, but he was glad he did. He said he learned things he hadn't known before, and he appreciated being treated with patience instead of judgment. He wrote that for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was in the way. That line stayed with me. He also wrote that after a lot of thought, he had made a difficult decision. He decided to limit his driving, not because anyone told him to, not because he was forced, but because he believed it was the responsible thing to do. He said letting go of something he loved didn't mean he was giving up. It meant he was protecting others. I sat there in my chair holding that letter, and I had to take a deep breath. That's not weakness, that's wisdom, and wisdom like that deserves respect. I realized then that the true outcome of that case had nothing to do with dismissing a ticket. The real outcome was dignity. He walked into my courtroom worried that he was becoming a burden. He walked out knowing he still mattered. That's the part people don't see when they watch court on television. They see rulings, they see decisions. They don't see the quiet impact that carries on after the courtroom empties. Not long after that, I found myself facing another difficult case. Different person, different circumstances. But as I listened, I heard the same fear beneath the words. Fear of not being enough anymore. Fear of slowing down. Fear of becoming invisible. And without even realizing it, I handled that case differently because of the veteran. I listened more carefully. I paused longer. I asked myself not just what the law required, but what fairness demanded. That's the ripple effect of moments like that. They don't end when the case ends. They change the judge too. I've always believed the law should be firm. It has to be. But firmness without compassion becomes cruelty. And compassion without accountability becomes chaos. The balance between those two is where justice lives. That silence in my courtroom that day wasn't accidental. It wasn't forced. It happened because everyone in that room recognized something real. They recognized effort, and effort has a way of commanding respect. I think about how rare it is for people to say out loud that they're trying their best. We live in a world that rewards confidence, speed, and certainty. Admitting struggle isn't encouraged, especially for men of that generation, especially for veterans. That's why his words mattered so much. I'm trying my best isn't a shield. It's not an excuse. It's a statement of values. It says I care. It says I take responsibility. It says I haven't given up, and that deserves to be heard. I also thought about my own future, about how one day I might be the one standing a little slower, seeing a little less clearly, hoping someone will listen instead of judge. That thought humbles you. It should humble all of us. When I look back on my years on this bench, I don't measure them by how many cases I decided. I measure them by moments like that, moments when the law did more than punish or excuse. Moments when it affirmed humanity. That veteran reminded me that strength doesn't disappear with age. It changes shape. Sometimes strength looks like standing tall. Sometimes it looks like knowing when to sit down. Sometimes it looks like admitting you need to do things differently. And sometimes strength looks like standing in a courtroom, looking a judge in the eye and saying, I'm trying my best. That response left my courtroom silent because everyone understood it. Everyone at some point in their life has been there, trying, hoping it's enough. So let me ask you something now. Have you ever felt like you were doing everything you could, even if it didn't look perfect? Have you ever hoped someone would see the effort behind the mistake? If you have, then you understand why that moment mattered so much to me. I've been on this bench for a long time. I've seen laws change. I've seen society change. But one thing hasn't changed. People want to be treated with dignity. They want to be heard. They want their effort to count for something. As long as I'm able to sit on this bench, that's what I'll try to remember. I'm Frank Caprio. I believe in justice. But more than that, I believe in people who keep trying, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Thank you for listening to this story. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is simply this: I'm trying my best.